My own daughter-in-law changed every lock in my farmhouse while I was still inside it, then stood in my kitchen and told me I had until Friday to leave. But she made one mistake. She never knew about the metal box buried beneath the floorboards of my barn. The box I had hidden there 37 years ago. The night my father pressed it into my hands and told me, "So, keep this safe. Someday everything will depend on it." Hello, friends. Thank you for joining me today. Before I tell you what happened, I would be grateful if you could subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It always means the world to me to see how far these stories travel. Now settle in, because this one takes some telling. My name is Raymond, and I am 68 years old. I have lived on this farm my entire life. 112 acres of rolling pasture outside Clarksville, Tennessee. Land my grandfather cleared by hand, and my father tended with every year of his working life before passing it to me. The old farmhouse sits up on a gentle rise, where you can see the tree line to the east catch fire every autumn morning. I raised my son Carter here. I buried my wife Helen here, under the white oak she planted the year we married. This land is not just property to me. It is the record of everything I have ever loved. For 31 years, Helen and I built something worth being proud of. We kept a modest cattle operation, leased the south pasture to a neighboring family, and in the evenings sat on the porch watching the fireflies come up from the creek bottom. When Helen died of cancer 4 years ago, something in me went quiet. The farm still ran. My hands still knew what to do. But the house felt like a held breath. My son Carter was 34 when his mother passed. He drove up from Nashville for the funeral in a car I did not recognize, wearing a watch that probably cost more than Helen's first year of school. He had done well for himself in real estate development, or so I was told. We had not spoken much in the years before Helen died. He visited at Thanksgiving when it suited him, called on birthdays if he remembered. After the funeral, though, he started coming around more. I told myself it was grief drawing him back. I was wrong about that. As I was wrong about several things. He brought his wife Shelby that first visit back. I had only met her twice before the wedding, and both times she had smiled at me, the way a person smiles at something they intend to return to the store. She was polite in the way that costs nothing. She admired the house with her eyes moving over the ceilings and the original hardwood floors in a way that had nothing to do with admiration. Carter told me she was in interior design. I noticed she took photographs of every room. They started coming every other weekend. I was grateful at first. The house was too quiet, and my hip had been giving me trouble since a bad step. The previous winter, Carter offered to help with repairs, and I let him. He replaced the sagging gutter on the north side of the house. He fixed the gate latch on the pasture fence. Small things, done well. And I felt something I had missed, the sense of my son working beside me on this land, the way I had worked beside my own father. But things shift slowly enough that you sometimes don't feel them shifting until you're somewhere you never meant to be. By the second year, Carter and Shelby were spending more weekends than not. Shelby began rearranging things. She moved Helen's ceramic dishes from the kitchen shelf to a box in the hall closet, explaining they were a clutter hazard. She replaced the living room curtains Helen had sewn herself with gray linen panels she ordered online. Each time I said something, Carter would put a hand on my shoulder and say, "Dad, she's just trying to help. You can't keep everything exactly as it was." And I would go quiet because he was right that I could not keep everything as it was. He used my grief as a door. Then came the conversation. I should have ended differently. It was a Sunday evening in March. Last year, Carter had grilled steaks on the back porch. The good ones. The kind he brought from a butcher in Nashville. He poured bourbon, the expensive bottle he kept in the cabinet, above the refrigerator, which had replaced my Jim Beam at some point I hadn't marked. Shelby sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and a pen, which I thought was strange. After a while, Carter leaned forward with his elbows on the table, and I recognized his expression. It was the same face he used to make as a boy when he wanted something he suspected I would refuse. "Dad," he said, We've been talking, and we want to do something that makes sense for everyone. You're not getting any younger, and this property is sitting under a complicated estate structure. When the time comes, probate on a farm this size is going to be a nightmare. Takes years. The government gets involved. You don't want that for me. I asked him what he was suggesting. Shelby uncapped her pen. A simple deed transfer. You sign the farm over to Carter now. As a gift. You keep living here. Nothing changes day to day. It just protects the asset and keeps the lawyers out of it later. I looked at my son. He was nodding as though she were describing something obvious. Something already decided. On the legal pad, I could see she had already written my name at the top of a list of action items. I said no. Carter's face went still. Not angry still. The way water goes still before a storm. Dad, you're being emotional about this. This is a financial decision. I told him that any decision about my land was an emotional decision, and that was not a flaw. He pushed for another half hour. Shelby cited figures about estate taxes and probate timelines that sounded rehearsed. I sat with my bourbon and said no in different ways, until finally Carter stood up and said he needed some air. Shelby gathered her legal pad with the controlled calm of someone who has lost a negotiation before and already knows how to run the next one. I thought it was over. That was my second mistake. 3 weeks later, I woke on a Wednesday morning to find 2 men in my driveway. They wore work shirts and carried a toolbox between them. They were changing the front door lock. Shelby stood on the porch in a fleece vest, holding a coffee mug with both hands, watching them work the way a project manager watches a crew. I came outside in my boots and my flannel and asked what was happening to my door. Carter had them all rekeyed, Shelby said, without turning around. The old locks were a security concern. I asked where my son was. In Nashville? He said to tell you he'd call later. They changed every exterior lock that day. Front door, back door, the side entrance off the mudroom, and the lock on the detached garage. When they finished, Shelby handed me a single key on a plain ring and told me this one was mine. One key to my own house. I called Carter from the kitchen. He answered on the second ring, and his voice was flat in a way I had never heard from him before. Not angry, not apologetic, flat and prepared. I've spoken to a property attorney, he said. Given that you've refused to do this reasonably, there are other options. We've been maintaining this property. We have documentation of the investment. There are legal pathways here. Dad, that you don't want me to go down. I asked him what pathways those were. You're 68. Your hip is bad. I have a letter from Dr. Wellman's office noting that you missed 2 follow-up appointments and that your memory-related screening is overdue. He paused. A conservatorship doesn't require a lot. Dad, especially on a voluntary basis. I sat down at Helen's kitchen table. The linen curtains Shelby had chosen moved slightly in the draft from the old windows. I looked at the shelf where Helen's ceramic dishes had been and were no longer, and I understood, sitting there, what the rearranging of things had always been about. You have until Friday of next week, he continued. Sign the transfer, or we begin the conservatorship process. Shelby has an estate attorney on retainer. You'd still live there. Nothing would change for you day to day. He said that last part exactly as Shelby had said it on the porch that Sunday. I recognized the line. I hung up without answering. I sat for a while. My hip ached. The house was very quiet. Outside, the white oak over Helen's grave was just beginning to leaf out, pale green against the gray April sky. Then I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked to the barn. My father, Ernest, had been a careful man, not secretive by nature, but careful, the kind of man who kept important things in important places and made sure the people he trusted knew where they were. The summer I turned 31, the year Carter was born, my father sat me down in this very barn on a turned-over feed bucket and told me something he had never told my mother, had never told anyone. Raymond, he said, there is something in this ground that belongs to you, and to your children, and no one else. I put it here because land can be argued over, but what's in this box cannot be argued with. He took me to the back corner of the barn, to the stall we had stopped using for horses years before. He lifted 3 floorboards and showed me a metal strongbox buried in the clay. Inside was a document he described only in general terms, a secondary deed, separately registered, with provisions and covenants that superseded any future transfer. He had had it drawn up by an attorney in Nashville years before the man who drafted it had died. No copies existed in the county recorder's office under any name Carter would know to search. Some families need this kind of protection. My father said, I pray you never do. But if you do, you'll know where to find it. I had not opened that box in 37 years. My hands were not entirely steady when I lifted the first plank. The clay underneath was cold and packed hard. I used the flat of a shovel to loosen it, the way my father had shown me. And after a few minutes, the edge of the metal box came up into the light. It was smaller than I remembered, and coated in a thin film of rust along the seams. I carried it to the workbench by the barn window and pried it open with a flathead screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept out the moisture for nearly 4 decades, were papers. I unfolded them carefully. My father's handwriting on the cover page was still clear. The formal cursive of a man who had learned penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse. The document beneath it was 10 pages, dense with legal language, and stamped at the bottom of each page with the seal of a Nashville attorney's office. I read it twice. Standing at that workbench with the late afternoon light coming through the dirty window and the smell of old hay around me, what my father had done was register a protective covenant on this property in 1987, binding in perpetuity, which stipulated that the land could not be transferred, seul, encumbered, or placed under conservatorship without the notarized consent of a named independent trustee, a provision that could not be waived by any single owner acting alone. The trustee named in the document was a man called George Hallett, a family friend and retired circuit court judge. George Hallett had died in 2009, but the document named a succession clause in the event of the trustee's death or incapacity. The trusteeship passed to the sitting president of the Clarksville Agricultural Heritage Foundation, and a nonprofit my father had helped establish in 1991. I stood there for a long time. Carter didn't know about this document. He had no reason to. My father had never spoken of it publicly, and I had nearly forgotten it myself. My son had built his entire strategy around the assumption that this farm's legal future was simply unencumbered, subject only to my signature and his leverage. He had no idea there was a registered covenant that made his conservatorship threat functionally worthless, because any conservator acting on my behalf would still need the trustee's consent to transfer this land. And the current trustee had never heard Carter's name. I folded the papers back into the oilcloth and carried the box inside. That night, I called a woman named Patricia Oakes, an attorney in Nashville I had found 3 years earlier when I was updating Helen's estate documents after she passed. I had liked her because she talked to me like I was capable of understanding things, which not everyone does with a man my age, who drives a pickup and wears mud on his boots to appointments. I explained the document to her as best I could, and she was quiet for a moment. Mr. Raymond, she said, if this covenant was properly registered, and the succession clause is valid, your son cannot complete a conservatorship that would allow property transfer without the trustee's sign-off. Do you have the original document? I told her I did. Can you be in my office Thursday morning? I said I could. I did not call Carter. I did not change my behavior in any visible way. Wednesday I did my regular chores, fed the cattle, checked the fence line on the east pasture, made my dinner and watched the news. Shelby called in the evening to ask if I had thought further about the transfer. I told her I was still thinking. She said she hoped I would make the right decision before Friday. I thanked her for calling and hung up. Thursday morning I drove to Nashville with the metal box on the passenger seat. Patricia Oakes spent 2 hours with me. She read every page of the covenant, made copies, and called a colleague who specialized in agricultural property law. When she came back into the conference room, her expression was professional. But I could tell she was pleased in the way lawyers get pleased when they find something ironclad. "The covenant is valid," she said. "It was properly registered in 1987 and has never been challenged or recorded as dissolved. The succession clause is enforceable. The current trustee is a woman named Diane Cowell. She's been president of the Heritage Foundation for the past 6 years." Patricia paused. "Mr. Raymond, your son's conservatorship strategy has a significant problem. Even if he filed and won, no transfer of this property could be completed without Diane Cowell's notarized consent, which she would have zero legal obligation to give. I asked her what she recommended. We contact Ms. Cowell to inform her of the situation. We send a formal notice to your son's attorney, outlining the covenant and its implications. And we make clear that any further attempt to intimidate you into signing a transfer, or to proceed with a conservatorship for the purpose of property acquisition, will result in a counterfiling for elder financial abuse." She folded her hands on the table. "Tennessee has strong statutes on that. The penalties are not minor." I thanked her. She shook my hand and said, "Your father was a smart man." I told her he was the smartest man I had ever known. The following Friday, Carter and Shelby drove up from Nashville in that car I still did not recognize. I had the sense they expected to arrive to a problem already solved, either my signature on the transfer or the beginning of a legal process they controlled. What they found instead was Patricia Oakes's associate, a young man named Marcus, parked in my driveway in a gray sedan, and a woman I had not met before, standing on my porch, Diane Cowell, the trustee, who had driven up from Nashville the night before at Patricia's request and stayed at the motel in town. Carter got out of the car. His face moved through several expressions before settling on the controlled confidence he used in professional settings. He looked at Marcus, then at Diane, then at me standing in the open doorway. "Dad," he said carefully. "Who are these people?" I introduced them. Diane stepped forward and handed Carter a sealed envelope. Marcus handed Shelby a second one. They were formal notices, copies of the covenant registration, documentation of the succession clause, and Patricia's letter outlining the elder financial abuse statute, along with a clear statement that any conservatorship filing intended to compel property transfer would be contested on those grounds. Carter tore open his envelope. I watched his face as he read. I had watched that face for 37 years. I had watched it at his first Little League game when he struck out and tried not to cry. I had watched it at his mother's graveside when he finally let himself. I watched it now as the strategy he and Shelby had built across months of careful planning quietly collapsed in his hands. "This isn't possible," he said, though his voice had lost its professional evenness. Diane said it was not only possible but documented and registered, and that she had confirmed the covenant's validity with the county recorder's office that morning. Shelby grabbed the papers from Carter's hands and scanned them fast. Her face did not change the way Carter's did. It just went very still. She was better at this than he was. Or maybe she simply had less feeling invested. "Where did this come from?" she asked. I told her it came from my father, who had been careful with things that mattered. Marcus spoke then, in the measured tone of someone delivering a message he has delivered before. He explained that they were not there to litigate anything that morning, only to ensure that all parties understood the legal landscape before any further action was taken. He noted specifically the documentation of Shelby's rekeying of the property without the owner's consent, which had been photographed and dated. He mentioned the recorded phone call. I had recorded Carter's conservatorship threat on the recommendation of Patricia, who had told me to do so, the evening Carter had called me. He said the word documentation 4 or 5 times in a calm voice. And I noticed Shelby stop reading the papers and start listening. Carter looked at me over the tops of those documents with an expression I did not know how to name. It was not the anger I had expected. It was something more complicated than anger, something that looked, if I am being honest, like a man recognizing himself in a mirror he had not known was there. He did not speak again for a long while. Then he asked if he could sit down. We all went inside. Shelby sat on the couch she had furnished. Carter sat in the chair that had been mine for 20 years. Marcus and Diane took the kitchen table. I stood near the window, near the curtains that were not Helen's, and I let the silence run until it ran out. Carter asked me, finally and quietly, why I had never told him about the covenant. I told him I had nearly forgotten it myself, and that I was sorry for that. Because if I had remembered it sooner, I might have had a different conversation with him before things went this far. He looked at his hands. I didn't think you'd actually fight me, he said. I told him that this land was not mine to give away under threat, and it was not his to take. It belonged to itself. In a way, to the people who had worked it, and the people buried in it, and the people who would work it after I was gone. I told him his grandfather understood that, and I had not always, but I understood it now. Shelby left the room at some point. I heard her moving through the back of the house. Carter and I stayed in the living room and talked. Just the two of us. For the first time in a long time. I do not want to call it a reconciliation, because that word implies something finished. And what happened that day was more like a beginning of a different kind of honesty between us. He told me things I had not known, that his real estate business had been struggling for over a year, that 2 major projects had fallen through, that he owed money to partners who were not patient men, that Shelby had come up with the farm plan, and he had told himself it was practical, not predatory. Because there is a difference between those words that is easy to blur when you are afraid. I told him I understood fear. I told him it did not excuse what he had done, but that I understood it. Shelby drove back to Nashville that afternoon. Carter stayed. He slept in his old room, not in the master suite they had informally taken over, but in the room with the pine bed frame I had built when he was 8 years old. In the morning I made eggs, and we ate at Helen's kitchen table without speaking much. After breakfast he went out to the barn with me. He didn't know much about the cattle operation anymore, but he learned fast once, and his hands remembered the old movements. We worked through the morning, and by noon I noticed the thing. I always notice when someone does real physical work on real ground that the unnecessary things fall off of them. That was 7 months ago. Carter and Shelby separated in June. He told me on the phone. Simply. Without drama. He has been back 3 times, since twice to help with fence repair on the east pasture, and once just to sit on the porch and talk. We are not where we were when he was a boy, and this land was adventure to him, and I was the man who knew everything. We are somewhere new, which is uncomfortable in the way that new things are. But it is honest ground. Shelby, from what I understand, has left Tennessee entirely. Carter mentioned she took a position with a firm in Charlotte. I wished her well in my thoughts, which cost me nothing, and settled something. The linen curtains are gone. I took them down myself and put up plain white ones I bought at the hardware store in town. They let in more light. Helen's ceramic dishes are back on the shelf where they belong. I found them in the hall closet where Shelby had boxed them, and I washed each one by hand and set them back in their places. And I stood there for a while in the early morning, looking at them on that shelf. The pale blue glaze she had loved. The way the light caught the rim of the largest one, my neighbor Franklin, who runs cattle on the property south of mine, started coming by on Sunday afternoons this past spring. He lost his wife 2 winters ago, and we had talked at the fence line for years, but never much more than weather and hay prices. Now he comes up the drive on Sundays, and we sit on the porch and drink coffee and talk about everything and nothing. He brought me a jar of his wife's canned tomatoes last month. He said he found a case of them in the cellar and didn't want them to go to waste. And I ate those tomatoes with eggs for 3 mornings in a row. And each morning I thought about how a jar of tomatoes put up by someone who is gone can still feed the living. I have spent some of this past year trying to understand what I should have done differently, and where I failed my son before it came to what it came to. I think about the years after Helen died, when I was so quiet, so turned inward, that I did not see what was growing in Carter: the debt, the desperation, the willingness to look at his father's land and see a problem to solve rather than a place to belong to. I do not know that I could have changed it, but I wish I had tried harder to stay in real conversation with him. rather than waiting for him to come to me. I also think about my father, that careful, quiet man who buried a metal box in a barn floor in 1987 because he understood something I only came to understand at 68, that love alone does not protect a thing you have built. You have to be practical about protection. You have to make arrangements. You have to not assume that what matters to you will matter equally to the people who come after you, because they are living in a different time with different fears, and fear changes what people are willing to do. My father saved this farm from a threat he never lived to see. He did it by being careful, by trusting the right people, by putting a document in a box, and a box in the ground and telling his son where it was. I walk past the white oak most evenings now, especially when the light is going. I do not have anything particular to say to Helen in those moments. I am not a man who speaks to graves, or at least I was not before. But I find myself standing near that tree and feeling less alone than I have any right to feel. Maybe that is what graves are, for not to hold the dead, but to give the living a place to stand. The farm is still here. The cattle are in the south pasture. The east fence holds. The barn smells of old wood and hay, and the particular kind of permanence that things acquire when they have lasted long enough. I am 68 years old. I have made mistakes that cost me years with my son and nearly cost me my land. I have learned things I wish I had learned earlier and forgotten things I should have held on to, and buried things in the ground that turned out to matter enormously. None of it was simple. None of it happened the way I would have written it. But I am still here, on land my grandfather cleared and my father tended, and I have spent my life trying to deserve. In that, on most mornings when the light comes through the east window and the coffee is hot, feels like enough. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Tell me in the comments, what is the most important thing someone in your family taught you about protecting what matters? Your stories are just as important as mine.